Elias Thorne stood on the penthouse balcony of his skyscraper, looking out over the city he seemingly owned. Below him, millions of lights flickered like a vast electric ocean. He adjusted his tailored suit, the fabric perfectly hugging his frame, and glanced at his luxury watch. At 50, Elias possessed an aura of untouchable confidence that commanded every room. To the world, he was the ultimate success story, a man who had conquered the tech industry through sheer brilliance. He was a monument to achievement, standing at the very top. His reputation preceded him everywhere. Snippets of news reports frequently hailed him as the visionary of the decade, while social media highlights showcased his presence at prestigious charity galas and tech summits. He was a public icon, a symbol of progress and philanthropy. People saw a man who had solved the world's most complex problems with a smile. Whether he was announcing a new green energy initiative or a scholarship fund, the narrative was always the same. Elias Thorne was the gold standard of modern leadership, a hero for the digital age. However, inside his luxury mansion, the perfection dissolved into a chilling silence. Dinner with his wife Clara and their daughter Maya was a hollow ritual. They sat around a long marble table surrounded by priceless art, yet the air was heavy with unspoken words. Clara played the role of the elegant, supportive wife, her smiles practiced and cold, while Maya barely looked up from her plate. There were no real conversations, only transactional exchanges about schedules and events. Behind the high walls of their estate, they were three strangers living in a beautifully decorated museum of a home. The first crack in his polished mask appeared when a private notification chimed on an encrypted app. Elias stepped away from the table, his heart hammered. The message was short and devastating. "The clock is ticking. Pay up, or the world sees the truth." His breath caught in his throat. For years he had managed to stay one step ahead of his mistakes, but this was different. The shadow of his past was finally catching up, threatening to tear down everything he had spent a lifetime building on a foundation of lies. Behind the closed doors of his home office, the secret struggle was even more intense. Elias reached into a locked safe, not to find treasures, but to hide a stack of final notice documents. His empire was bleeding cash, and his personal accounts were nearly empty. He took a pill for severe anxiety, waiting for the chemical calm to wash over him as he stared at the mounting evidence of his fraud. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of his deception becoming a physical burden he could no longer carry alone. Driven by pure desperation, Elias made a move that could destroy his family forever. He contacted an old mentor, begging for one last massive loan to stay afloat. To secure the money, he used the family mansion as collateral, signing the papers in secret without a word to Clara. He was gambling their entire future on a single frantic hope that he could turn the tide before anyone noticed the missing funds. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, pulling everyone down with him. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The tension culminated during a live televised interview about his legendary success. As the cameras rolled, Elias's phone vibrated in his pocket. Another warning. The interviewer looked him in the eye and dropped a bombshell. "Elias, some say your empire is built on glass. What do you say to the rumors of the missing pension funds?" The studio lights suddenly felt like an interrogation. Elias froze, the silence stretching into an agonizing eternity. His face was broadcast to millions, a trapped man realizing the world was finally looking past his constructed mask at last. The silence on the television set was deafening. Elias Thorne, once the man with every answer, sat paralyzed as the studio lights carved through his composure. Millions watched as a single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. Within minutes, the clip went viral. Social media erupted with the comment Thorne fraud, and as he stepped out of the studio, his company's stock began a record-breaking freefall. The visionary of the decade had become a cautionary tale in one night. His phone was now a hive of calls from angry investors. The empire was not just cracking, it was vaporizing in real time. Desperate, Elias reached out to Marcus, his right-hand man, and the only one who knew the true depth of the deception. But the line remained dead for hours. When Marcus finally answered, his voice was devoid of the camaraderie they had shared for decades. Marcus informed him that the authorities had already come knocking, and he had made a choice to protect himself. To save his own skin, Marcus had signed a deal, handing over internal ledgers for full immunity. Elias was being discarded by the man he had helped make a billionaire. The betrayal left him gasping alone in the backseat of his car. Home offered no sanctuary. He found Clara in the foyer, her expression hardened into a mask of resentment. On the marble countertop lay the documents he had tried to hide, the collateral papers for their estate. She didn't ask for explanations. Instead, she spoke of the social ruin he had brought upon her name. She admitted she had only stayed for the security he provided. Now that the accounts were frozen and the house was forfeit, there was nothing left for her. By morning, her suitcases were gone, and the mansion felt like a tomb echoing with the silence of their failed marriage. The following week was a blur of humiliation. Elias stood by as federal agents and movers stripped his life bare. They carried out the Renaissance sketches and the hand-carved furniture. Finally, they took the keys. Elias found himself sitting on the cold floor of an empty living room, his own breathing the only sound in the hollow space. For 15 years, he had lived a lie so grand it had convinced even him. But now, stripped of his finery, he was just a man in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his unbridled ambition. In the silence, his mind drifted back to where it all began. He hadn't started as a villain. He remembered a younger version of himself, working 3 jobs to pay for his mother's medical bills. When insurance denied the claims, he made one small unethical choice, altering invoices to secure a surplus. He told himself it was a one-time necessity, but that small crack in his integrity had widened. To cover the first lie, he told a second, until the fraud became the engine of his success. The tragedy was that his mother had died anyway, leaving him with a fortune built on grief. A footfall interrupted his thoughts. It was Maya. She didn't bring lawyers, she just stood there with a profound sadness that cut deeper than any indictment. Elias tried to explain he did it for them, but she stopped him with a weary look. She asked why he had never trusted her enough to be poor. She would have preferred an honest father over a visionary who was a ghost. Her disappointment was the final weight that broke his spirit. She left him there, a man who realized he had nothing of value. Driven by a final instinct to survive, Elias made his way to the darkened garage. Hidden behind a loose brick was a bag with cash and a fake passport. As he reached for it, a floorboard creaked. A figure stepped forward into the dim light. It was a face Elias hadn't seen in over a decade. It was the friend he had stepped over to get his first big break, a man everyone thought was dead. The man smiled, but his eyes were as cold as the grave. The shadow moved, and the flickering garage light revealed a face Elias had tried to bury in the deepest recesses of his conscience. It was the man whose life Elias had dismantled 20 years ago to secure his first major patent. Everyone believed he had vanished into the darkness of despair, rumored to have taken his own life after the scandal Elias orchestrated. But here he stood, older, scarred by the years of struggle, yet possessing a clarity that Elias had long since lost. The blackmailer wasn't interested in the hidden cash or the forged passport Elias clutched in his trembling hand. The man watched him with a pity that stung worse than any physical blow. He didn't demand the money. Instead, the former friend spoke of the decades spent in the shadows, watching Elias's face on billboards while he struggled to rebuild a shattered existence. He presented Elias with a final, brutal choice. He could take the cash and the fake identity, living as a ghost in a foreign land, forever looking over his shoulder for a debt that could never be repaid. Or he could finally do the one thing he had avoided his entire career, tell the absolute, unvarnished truth. The man's eyes offered a quiet chance for redemption. For the first time, Elias felt the suffocating weight of his facade collapse entirely. The adrenaline of the escape faded, replaced by a profound, soul-aching exhaustion. He looked at the bag of money, the physical manifestation of his final lie, and realized it was nothing more than paper. He dropped it on the concrete floor. He wouldn't run. He spent the next few hours in the hollowed-out shell of his office, illuminated only by the dim light of a tablet. He didn't call his lawyers. Instead, he recorded a raw, unfiltered video message intended for Maya. He spoke of the fear that drove his first theft and the devastating realization that he had traded his daughter's respect for a kingdom of glass. When the sun began to crest over the city skyline, Elias didn't head for the airport. He walked toward the police headquarters. The morning air was crisp, and for the first time in years, the crushing tightness in his chest had vanished. As he approached the glass doors, the familiar swarm of paparazzi descended, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. In the past, Elias would have adjusted his tie and donned his mask of untouchable confidence. Now he simply walked forward with his head bowed, not in shame but in a strange, new-found dignity. He surrendered to the authorities, feeling a sense of liberation that no amount of wealth had ever provided. Years passed, marked not by quarterly earnings, but by the slow, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. Behind the grey walls of a minimum security facility, Elias found a purpose that felt real. He spent his days in the prison library, not researching legal loopholes, but teaching younger inmates about ethics and the gravity of every choice. The tailored suits were replaced by a simple, coarse uniform, yet his posture was straighter than it had ever been at the height of his power. He was no longer a symbol. He was a teacher, a man who had paid his debt and found that the currency of a clear conscience was more valuable than gold. The true turning point came on a quiet afternoon in the visitor's room. Maya sat across from him, her eyes no longer filled with the cold disappointment that had haunted his dreams. They talked for hours about her life and the simple things he had missed while he was busy being an icon. There was no wealth to provide security, only the fragile, honest bond of a father and daughter who finally knew each other. Elias realized then that his greatest success wasn't the skyscraper that still bore his name, but the fact that he could look his daughter in the eye without a single secret between them. Eventually the gates opened, and Elias stepped back into a world that had moved on. He found a quiet life, working for a charitable organization that helped victims of financial fraud. One evening, he sat on a weathered park bench, watching the sky turn to gold. He had no titles, no board of directors, and no offshore accounts. He was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to live for. As the last light faded, he took a deep breath, finally at peace. Success, he understood at last, isn't what you collect. It's what you don't have to hide.